retirements continue to be a little bit higher, which is concerning, especially in your industry, Chris, because our workforce is just shrinking.
And so there's this mass exodus of skilled people, right? This workforce shrinkage is not just there's a number of people that aren't doing the blue collar job, which is what you see.
Everybody believes that employees are looking for pay, that pay is the reason they're leaving. And I have said this, I don't know, countless times. When you really talk to employees, what they're going to say is, you don't pay me enough to put up with, and then you can fill in the blank.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Talent Tide Podcast, the show that ensures you have the information you need to adapt and evolve your workplace culture as you ride the wave of change in talent management. I'm your host, Chris Nichols, and today we'll be chatting with Danny Nelms of the Work Institute. The Talent Tide Podcast is sponsored by Endeavous. Endeavous is a full-service recruiting firm offering a broad range of solutions from professional contracting to retained and contingency search to recruitment outsourcing. Endeavous prides itself on its core values of being bold, accountable, help first, passionate, and results driven to ensure the talent we bring to our partners matches their core values and overall mission. For more information, please visit endeavous.com. That is ENDEVIS.com. I'm excited to have Danny on. He's a local Nashville native as well. He's here in the 615 area with me. Danny is the president of the Work Institute. He's a co-author of the bestseller Employer Engagement, the Fresh and Dissenting Voice on the Employment Relationship, and he's a sought-after public speaker. Danny is an agent of change, thought leader, and an expert in helping companies forge new directions that improve business results. His insights into human capital dynamics of organizations based on sound data-driven research uniquely positions Danny and the Work Institute to provide valuable recommendations for the challenges that organizations face and allows him to provide companies with the tools they need to successfully manage organizational improvement. Welcome to the Talent Tide Podcast, Danny. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm glad you finished with that long introduction. That was too much.
I even shortened it a little bit, but I understand. I feel the same way. Oftentimes when somebody's reading my bio or they're going to read my bio, I say, hold on a second. How much are you reading here? Let me shorten this up. But I'm excited to have you on because it's October 11th, 2021, and every company that I seemingly have talked to over the last 3 months has a major problem with retention, which is something that the Work Institute measures and helps companies quantify why people are leaving. And so I can't think of a better time to be having this conversation with, I don't know, are we calling it the Great Resignation, the Great Rehire? I guess it's whatever positive spin you want.
All I can tell you is that it's real. Whether you want to call it the turnover tsunami or the Great Resignation or the rehire, it doesn't matter what word you want to use. It is real. And it is the biggest challenge I believe companies are facing right now.
Could not be more accurate. It is very real. And one of the reasons why I'm excited to have you on is because we're getting a lot of inbound activity, Danny. Endeavous as an organization, we have companies reaching out to us. Our SDRs are taking on more calls than ever before. They're getting more responses to their emails because it seems like I would say roughly at least 75% of companies right now need help hiring. And that's not just in healthcare, which is a major industry that we work with, but across blue collar and even white collar level roles, organizations for the first time are really understanding that you can't just recruit. You have to retain people, and I don't know that many of them know how to. So I'm hoping today we can talk a little bit about your retention report, which I believe you had a mid-year retention report. I'm assuming you'll probably be doing another one next year. If you've never found one of those retention report for the listeners, just go Google the Work Institute, follow them on LinkedIn. It seems like I get peppered with that information when they come out, and it's really valuable in my mind to take to the C-suite to say, here's where we need to make changes, right? Because operationally, most organizations go right to dollars and cents, and there is a dollar and cents component to this, but it's not in the way that you think. So, Danny, would you provide a little bit of an overview from your mid-year report and what data points you had taken in maybe through the first part of the year, and then we can transition to where we are today?
Just to give you a little bit of backdrop there, Chris, this is the 5th year that we've done we call our annual retention report. So it was the 2021, the COVID edition. It came out in late March, early April. In some respects, it's a retrospective of the previous year. So Work Institute conducts exit interviews for well over 100 organizations, and we conduct about 35 to 40,000 exit interviews annually. So, and a really good sort of mix of industries, mix of different type of roles within organizations. So we take all that normative data, if you will, and package it up and report out the things that are the reasons why people left. And then we look for some other interesting hypotheses to explore. What we found really interesting last year was certainly that the pandemic impacted significantly the reasons why people left. So you saw things like health and family reasons increase significantly. You saw retirements increase significantly. We saw a little bit downward trend in things like work-life balance and some downward trends in career reasons. And what we, kind of hypothesized in the early summer was that with the beginnings of this turnover tsunami, how is that impacting the reasons why people leave? And so because we have such a large database, we felt like it was completely appropriate to look at what happened in the first half of 2021. And so we took, I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of around 11,000 exit interviews, which is a really great sample size, by the way, and looked at those reasons. And what we found is that work-life balance reasons continued to decline. And I think this is really reflective of the fact that many employers are discovering that flexibility is just a real key that employees need and want. We have seen retirements continue to be a little bit higher, which is concerning, especially in your industry, Chris, because our workforce is just shrinking. We've just got a smaller workforce. So it makes it all the more difficult to recruit, but all the more important to retain the employees that we have, is because we just, in almost all cases, have a smaller pool to try and generate candidates from. We also have seen that pay reasons went up in the first half of the year. And I know that everybody's going to react to that and say, see, it's pay, it's pay. Well, it only rose to the level that was pre-pandemic. And that is still less than 1 in 10 employees leave their job for the root cause of pay. And so, I think this is, if no one takes anything away from this podcast, other than that, it's the thing that we preach over and over and over again, is that everybody believes that employees are looking for pay, that pay is the reason they're leaving. And I have said this, I don't know, countless times. When you really talk to employees, what they're going to say is, you don't pay me enough to put up with, and then you can fill in the blank. You can fill in the blank for a bad manager. You can fill in the blank for, you don't develop me as an employee. You don't give me career opportunities. You give me a bad manager. I mean, the list can go on and on. Pay is just the substitute for that. And what our data continues to prove is pay is not the biggest reason why people leave their job.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned, there was an interesting piece you mentioned about retirees a moment ago. And this past weekend, Southwest airline had to cancel 1,800 flights. Completely disrupted a ton of people's flight plans and patterns. I'll be honest, I'm a devout Southwest flyer myself. Being here in Nashville, it's a huge hub for them. But this year alone, I have flown 10 plus times, and 80% of my flights have been delayed, canceled, rerouted, rescheduled, etc. And what I read in this morning's little piece was that last year Southwest had so many requests for early retirement. They had 2,200 pilots request an early retirement because they were offered the opportunity. Uh, I know because we have an organization that we have previously worked with in the past that was in the helicopter and air life evacuation medical space. There's a shortage of pilots. That was 2+ years ago. Now we have companies like a Southwest that have opted individuals into an early retirement. And so there's this mass exodus of skilled people, right? This is not this workforce shrinkage is not just there's a number of people that aren't doing the blue collar job, which is what you see, but they're skilled individuals. It feels like on the bottom side of the workforce spectrum too, Danny, we're seeing less. This is purely speculation, but we're seeing less teenage and college age kids in the workforce. At least that's my perspective, considering that all the retail and hospitality type jobs are not being filled up. Food, et cetera, restaurants, things of that nature. Do you have any thoughts that you can share on that space and what we're seeing just from the workforce
Chris,
shrinkage
there's a
piece?
great book out there that if any of your listeners are interested, I think it's worthy of a read, and it's a pretty easy read. It's called The Age Curve, and it's by Gronbach. I think Gronbach, I think is his name. And the premise of the book, and this was written several years ago, but I think it's relevant today, is that one of the things that we don't look at is we always talk about the generations, right? You've got the baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y. We talk about all these differences in the generations in terms of how they behave in the workplace. And that's a whole other podcast, by the way, because we we do way too much stereotyping when it comes to that. But what we don't look at is what is the size of that generation. So a lot of what happened in the previous, not the 2000, in the 2009 recession was you had, major issues in cars and housing, right? Well, it turns out that the Gen X generation was like 10 to 11% smaller than the baby boomers. So when we got to the car buying and home buying age, there were 10% fewer of us. And so, now there were some other underlying issues in that recession, obviously, but we don't look at some of those demographics. And what we're finding is that there's lower birth rates now. And so there are just fewer people in this age range in this workforce. And so it is getting more difficult. And again, it just places such emphasis on recruiting. Now, there was another dynamic certainly at play. And I think if we didn't talk about it just for a minute, Chris, we'd be mistaken, is that there was the unemployment supplements that were being provided by, the federal government. There was a lot of talk about, you couldn't attract people back into the workforce because they were making more money potentially on unemployment. And I think there's some truth in that. I think to think that didn't exist, it would be naive. But that's ended for almost every state. And now you are seeing some of those people absolutely enter the workforce. But now the real work begins in, now that we're getting them back into our payroll, how are we going to keep them? And that is going to be the difficult part, because if you think getting them is the hard part, keeping them is even harder.
Absolutely. I think, the September, or I guess it was the October jobs report last week was abysmal, right, for the month of September, and the number of jobs hired and filled, et cetera. So we're coming off of that, which has kind of been a strange phenomenon, right? Like those payments have ended, and yet we had a very slow hiring month last month. I think there's a number of reasons for that. The most valuable to me being that people are finding different ways to make money. I mean, yes, the gig economy is a real thing as well. We have some best practices that we have manufacturing clients relying on right now, Danny, are more flexible shift scheduling. Going back to your earlier comment about employees desire flexibility, especially right now, if you have kids and they're in school systems, it's a mess. During the month of September, my kids I have 3 kids. All 3 of them were out at different times because they were exposed to COVID or this or that. Luckily, I work from home. I can't imagine families that have kids in school and have had to deal with this for the last 6 months. I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen a lot of women leave the workforce. Are your reports and your data points showing that you're seeing more women leaving, and for what reasons?
Yes. I mean, there's no doubt that um, the pandemic affected female workers a little more substantially when it came to the health and family issues. And so we saw an uptick in that, but it also affected, other ethnic groups more significantly, African American groups, Asian American groups as well. So there were a lot of interesting dynamics at play in the, kind of that pandemic. And let's face it, we're still in the middle of it. I mean, it just doesn't want to go away.
Sure.
And yes, the child care issue played a significant role, as did elder care to some degree, because, in many cases we have, you know, personally, my wife's parents we happen to have an apartment in our home, and they live with us. So, and we were taking special care to make sure that they weren't, going out and exposing. So, yes, they went to the grocery store, but if we could make a little extra trip along the way to keep them from having to go out, we would. So, and luckily they don't need a lot of specific care, but there's a lot of instances where there were those circumstances where you had to care for an elderly, or quite frankly, someone that had experienced COVID. And how many stories have we heard where a loved one has been in the hospital for 39 days? Well, someone's got to be
Yeah,
available during that time period as well. So we've just had so many difficult circumstances
absolutely.
throughout our workforce, and it just continues to put so much stress on this massive system that we call the workforce.
I don't want to continue to beat the dead horse. I don't want to transition, but I think we can agree that the COVID-19 pandemic has rapidly evolved the workplace. It has changed the way that we have to think about employee engagement. But one thing has remained: we still have bad managers, Danny. Throughout organizations, there were bad managers before the pandemic. There's bad managers today, and from my experience, it seems that bad management, direct management, is a very significant indicator of poor retention rates.
So, Chris,
What
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead,
what
Chris. I
can
didn't
we
mean to
do?
interrupt you.
Can you talk about that, sir? No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
No,
I'd
go
love to
ahead.
talk about it. And actually, we didn't even talk about it before this podcast, but I have a little additional research that I'm willing to share. So, um, we have been gathering manager ratings in exit interviews for a number of years. And but we wanted to make sure that when we started to look into the area of predictive analytics, that we had a really solid base of data. It's one of the things that's always important to Work Institute is we want to make sure that if anybody ever looks under the hood of the research that we're doing, that it is scientifically and statistically sound. And so we wanted to look at how manager ratings affected categories for reasons for leaving. So in our retention report that you mentioned earlier, we look at reasons for leaving in 2 ways. We look at categories for leaving, meaning things like career reasons, environment reasons, work-life balance reasons. And then within each of those categories, there are sub-themes. So within career, for example, there's promotion, there's different type of work, there's development, there's job security. So all of those things sort of roll up into a category. And so we wanted to look at how manager ratings impact the categories for leaving. And it turns out that manager ratings directly predict 6 different categories for leaving. And those include career, environment, involuntary, the job itself, the manager, and work-life balance. So 6 of the 10 categories are all directly predicted by manager ratings. Now, here's the tricky part, because I think there's typically 2 narratives when it comes to retention. So we talked about the first one, pay. People leave for pay. And then the second one is they leave because of their manager. Well, I think we're overstating that or misstating that to a certain degree, because the manager influences all of these reasons, but isn't always responsible for them. And quite frankly, isn't very well developed around them. So one of the things that I've been talking a lot about, Chris, is, for example, around career. How often do we actually develop our managers to be career coaches? We don't. We don't teach them how to help help their employees to navigate their career within the company. And quite frankly, in some cases, we actually penalize managers for helping to do that. I was talking to a colleague of mine just a few weeks ago, and he said that in their company, and I'm not going to mention the company, that if a person transfers to another role, be it a lateral move or a promotion, that turnover counts against that manager. So they're actually helping to develop someone to stay with the company, move into another role, often being promoted, and they actually get dinged for the turnover in their department. I can't imagine that scenario.
They should be getting bonus.
That's exactly right. That should be a celebration, right? So we've got to be careful in thinking about how managers impacted. But one of the things that we do see is that manager behavior itself is a big factor in why ratings are going up or down. And we kind of give this I don't love the term, but manager professionalism, if you will. And those are things like communication, availability, their just overall demeanor, their management skills. And one of the things that we found interesting in 2020 was that the ratings of managers actually went up. I would have bet you lots of pocket change, because I don't have a lot of money, that during the pandemic era of 2020, that managers ratings would have gone down, because I felt like managers probably weren't doing very well. Well, it turns out they did better than expected.
Sure.
And the reason they did better than expected is because their professionalism actually improved. And think about it. Their availability improved. People perceived that they were more available. And that sort of is counterintuitive, because you're saying, well, how did that happen when we weren't in the office together? But how many Zoom calls did you participate on a weekly basis where your manager was actually there? Did you see your manager more during 2020 than you do regularly? I bet you did.
And absolutely. So personal experience.
The same thing
as somebody that began working from home in 2018. So in 2018, I began working from home, Danny. And in Devis, I'll be honest, we were a bit archaic. We didn't have great processes to manage virtual employees. We're getting better at it today. But having the pandemic force our hand to be virtual and learn how to be virtual, right? Learn how to use Teams calls, learn how to communicate differently. It improved our overall employee experience, in my opinion, tenfold. And again, that's just an opinion, but I know as a remote employee that it was a lot harder pre-pandemic to have everybody centered. Like, we couldn't even do a group call effectively pre-pandemic. It was like, okay, well, you got to call into this number, and then you got to call in, and we're going to do this, and we're going to have a mic here, and you can hear over here. We fixed all of that, right? And that to me was so valuable. And I was actually at the Tennessee State SHRM conference in August, and Gallagher had an employee engagement survey, and I thought these were interesting numbers. So they had 4 engagement diagnostics, Danny: loyalty, job satisfaction, promoter behavior, so that net promoter type thing, and discretionary effort, which that was an interesting one. Willing to put in extra effort to help the organization succeed. So pre-pandemic, people were happy with their jobs. They were willing to promote their jobs, and they were willing to put in extra effort, but they had no loyalty. In the pandemic, their loyalty skyrocketed because they didn't want to lose that job, but they were unwilling to put in discretionary effort, a significant downtrod. They didn't want to put in any extra effort. Their promoter behavior went down, and so did job satisfaction. And now in the pandemic transition, which is probably around the same period that your report was, loyalty went bright red the other direction. Job satisfaction went down again. Promoter behavior went down significantly, and discretionary effort continued to go down further. So, can you kind of speak to that employee motivation, I guess, and where they are in this post-pandemic, kind of still pandemic environment?
Yeah, the managers are having a significant impact. And what we found, again, is that as that professionalism improves, then so do those overall ratings. And then that in turn obviously is impacting our reasons for leaving. And so I believe that what we've got to do is to start to look at not just the manager professionalism is something that we've got to improve in organizations, but then we've got to start to add to their toolkit. And so we've got to look at things like how are they helping employees manage their careers within the organization? How are they being stewards of the culture? How are they working through these work-life balance issues? And I think this one's going to be huge, Chris, because I was reading an article earlier and I couldn't agree with it more, is that by and large, we're trying to solve work-life balance issues and especially remote work issues through policy. And it made the point that no policy is going to be perfect for each department, each company, each individual. We're going to have to go at this from an individual standpoint. And what that's going to happen is it's going to create conflict. And it's going to create conflict that we have not prepared managers to deal with, because they like to fall back on, well, there's the company policy. And as long as we're adhering to the company policy, everything will be okay. And I'm going to be okay. And we're going to have to get away from that, because it's just not going to be a one size fits all.
I couldn't agree more. We live in an environment today that we're moving from customized solutions in the workforce to personalized solutions. And each and every employee, because of the nature of our lives today, requires some amount of personalization. If you want to retain that individual, you can't expect a blanket to cover each and every one of them. And that changes how we engage. And so the last topic I did want to hit on, Danny, was employee engagement. And where do we go from here? Because I think that we've been seeing, it seems that we've kind of been doing the same thing for the last 2 decades in varying degrees of, hey, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and it's going to net this. But is that really the right way forward? Like, what do we do? What are we doing? How can we improve things?
Wow, we could spend days on this, Chris, but I'm going to try and make this really quick and easy. So you mentioned earlier in the introduction that we wrote a book called Employer Engagement. So I'm not trying to plug the book, but I wanted to mention that the working title of that book prior to actually putting it out and publishing it was not Employer Engagement. It actually was called The Engagement of One, because at the end of the day, we have this belief system that engagement becomes a very individual phenomenon, right? It's about Chris being engaged. It's about Danny being engaged. It's about William or Kelly or Ann or Glenn. And it's about what engages them in the organization. And I've used this example for years that for me, when I was early in my career, everything was about career progression. That's all I cared about. If you could show me the next rung, I was going to work myself as hard as I could and be as loyal and engaged and involved as I could to get to that next level. My wife, on the other hand, has no interest in being promoted ever. And so she wanted, we have one son. She wanted to be able to be a little flexible with, picking him up at school at times or being at the school event and those type of things. So that flexibility was critical to us. What we've tried to do is to narrow employee engagement to a set of questions, 12, 16, 35 questions that measure engagement. Well, how can you figure out the right set of questions to figure out if those two disparate attitudes are actually engaged in their work? I don't think it can happen. And so I think part of why I think we failed is that we've spent entirely too much time trying to put a single number on engagement for an entire population. And what we are doing, and I didn't come on here to promote Work Institute, but I think it's so relevant is that we look at employee engagement very differently. So you've got two schools. One, we're trying to measure engagement. Two, we're taking a library of questions and we're developing our engagement survey based on what we want to know. And when I say we, I'm saying we, the employer, want to know. We've actually developed a survey from the 500,000 interviews we've done with employees that tell us what's important to employees. And that's what I think is missing, Chris. I think employee engagement is about what's important to employees. And I think we continue to ignore that fact. I think we measure things that are either important to this faulty measurement of engagement or the things that we think are important to us. And the concept behind employer engagement is we have to figure out how to engage employees. It's our responsibility to create the conditions. Well, if we're going to create those conditions, we better know what's important to them. And I think we're missing that mark. That's what I think is wrong in the employee engagement world. That sounded
I love
very
that.
much like a soapbox statement.
No, stand on that soapbox as much as possible, because we've got to get companies thinking differently. We need CEOs, we need CFOs, we need COOs to understand that employee engagement is a significant metric that they need to be tracking for the success of their companies, right? Unhappy employees create unhappy customers, and unhappy customers means that your business might cease to exist, right? And so we live in the workforce now is much more transient than it's ever been. The number of opportunities that individuals have within a 2 to 3 hour radius of where they live, even in rural areas, has been exponentially magnified, right? Like, so, take Nashville, for example. One of the reasons that people are moving here so rapidly is because there's an abundance of opportunities, and those number of opportunities don't sound like they're going to be shrinking anytime soon. And individuals aren't tied to their hometowns as much as they once were. I grew up on a farm. There's plenty of people back home to take care of that farm. They don't need me. So I can come to Nashville and chase my dreams, right? I can do different things. I can go live in a different environment because I've been exposed to what it's like to live in a city or be in a city. Whereas like my parents weren't, right? Like they only knew their little world that they grew up in rural Southern Illinois, and it's a little scary to get out from there. And so companies have to realize that we as people don't need you as much as they need us, right? Companies need us a lot more than we as individuals need them. There's too many opportunities that exist. And when we think about the employee engagement, Danny, and how we measure it, do you find that companies are too often measuring it on a broad spectrum and understanding, like from a company-wide area, what that looks like versus maybe a different perspective on it?
Well, again, what we find is that they're trying to place a single number on it, and they do look at it by departments, and some will look at it at the manager level. But what we look at are what we call the 4 core drivers, and it's really not a lot of argument about the drivers. A lot of other engagement survey type companies would agree with us and may have the same exact ones, and it really boils down to 4 things: the job itself, the manager, the team I work with, and the organization as an employer. Those 4 things really are at the core of both retention and engagement. But what we do is we just look at how people are perceiving those 4 core drivers. And those core drivers, the things that are important within each of those, have come from our interviews with employees. So again, we've done 500,000 stay interviews and exit interviews over the course of our 20 plus year history. So we've got a pretty good idea about why employees feel the way they do about their job, the reasons they feel the way they do about their manager. And so we've taken those and built that as the foundation for our employee engagement measurement system. Not trying to measure engagement, but just simply by measuring the core drivers and knowing that we've learned from employees what's important to them about it. So, this whole issue around manager availability, for example, it's really important to employees that your manager is available, that they're accessible. And I don't know that I've ever seen that question presented in a traditional engagement survey. Um, Maybe it has, and there's literally thousands of them out there, but I've never seen it. And so I think it's those little tweaks again that is turning the perception from this is an employer responsibility to create the conditions, not the employee's responsibility to just simply be engaged. And if we can flip that mindset ever so slightly, I think that's where the real difference is going to be made. And by the way, that's going to fix a ton of your retention issues as well. They go hand in hand.
Absolutely. So, moral of the story here is before you call Endevis, call Danny. Let Danny measure the effectiveness of your retention efforts and your employee engagement. And then we'll come in and help you hire all the people. How's that sound, Danny?
Well, and Chris, I think that it's so important. And I think maybe one of the things that I don't use this term a lot because I think it gets confusing, but our founder, Dr. Tom Mahan, who founded the company, he always talks about we're an attraction and retention company. And I tell him all the time, well, the problem is when we call ourselves an attraction company, then they think we're recruiters. They think we're RPOs like Endevis. But that's not actually what he's saying. What he's saying is that you have to constantly be attracting and re-attracting the people that are there. And so it is a constant ongoing attraction effort to keep the people that you already have. And interestingly enough, if you're doing that well, it will help you to attract people from the outside to come to work for you. We talked about that a little earlier, Chris, is that, if you get that negative reputation in the marketplace, good luck trying to hire people. But if you've got the most positive reputation in the marketplace, then generally people are going to be lining up at your door.
I love what Dr. Tom says there. It applies to when I do speaking presentations. I have a piece in there about how employee retention is a lot like marriage, and that talent acquisition is a lot like dating, right? When you're trying to attract those candidates, everybody's seeing the best side of both sides. Maybe there's a few white lies that are thrown in there. Once you're married to each other, you know where all of the landmines are. You know what bad parts about the company. You know what you like, what you don't like. But you have to continue to date, right? No different than a marriage. In order to keep it together, you've got to continue to be working together.
And that's where you brought up the managers earlier. And the manager is such a key part of that relationship, right? Because retention and engagement is also local. If we think we can have enough town hall meetings that are hosted by the CEO to create retention engagement, we're kidding ourselves. It happens at a local level. And by local, I mean at the manager level, at the supervisor level. That's where the best environment is created. And that's where we're actually going to create engagement and retention.
Love it, Danny. That's a wrap on another episode of the Talent Tide podcast. But Danny, how can people find you, find your retention reports, etc.?
Yeah, it's really easy. We're at workinstitute.com. So you can simply come to our website. There is a resources tab. So there you will find not only our retention reports, but case studies. We have really interesting content called Essential Guides that talks about things like exit interviews and stay interviews and engagement surveys. And we really try and create them as sort of unbiased learning documents that people can, I think, learn from in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. Certainly you can follow me on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, I should say. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook. So there's all those avenues. And I will say that we put out, I think, some of the best content in the country on retention. And so connecting with us, following Work Institute on LinkedIn, you'll be able to get access to that content.
I second that. You should definitely do that. So again, thanks for being on the podcast today, Danny. We appreciate it. Maybe it sounds like we need to have you back again for some different conversations, but Please be sure to subscribe, like, rate the podcast wherever you listen. And remember, success is on the other side of fear. Thank you and have a great day.